Do you believe that America is a great country?
We have a lot of potential. We have 25% less people than all of Europe, 36% more wealth. Only 0.17% of America makes $1 million. They're not obligated to tell you, but a lot of those corporations even write legislation. Just the audacity of doing it in front of everybody's face, to me, that is like the most frustrating.
We're here with Juan Paredes, Democrat, running for United States Representative, State of Florida, District 28. Do you believe that the government should have a balanced budget?
Well, not necessarily if that's the primary goal. Like if there's, if you have a balanced budget while completing all your goals, that's perfectly fine. But these days, especially now in modern times, debt is necessary for society, and we invest in the future now to make production, and that is much more productive of an economy than saving and then doing production and then selling the production or doing the financing after the production's done. That's how it was in the past. Like the Lord would own the land, the people would produce things, and then they would give the Lord their portion, and then the financing would happen from there. But we advanced as an economy beyond that, and now we finance the production first from the very beginning, and then that will in the future return on investment. So if we're doing it to return on investment in the future, I think it's actually a very beneficial thing. It helps speed up production. But if we're just balancing the budget and doing austerity to do so, I think it would actually harm the economy a lot more to do that instead.
Why do you believe the government is different than any regular person that can only spend what they can make?
Well, a regular person's revenue is different than a government. So a regular person, they work and they receive wages for the most part. There are people, of course, who get money from what they own as from assets and the revenue from their companies. But generally, for the most part, most people, they work for their money. They expend labor, and then they receive a wage. Now, government, they make money vastly, in many different ways. And on top of that, a government is going to last for a long time. So we can have long-term planning of the future. We can incur debt that can be paid off in 50, 100 years because for the most part, the United States is not going to go away as an entity. And if we do, then the debt is least of our worries. So, a person is a lot more finite and their concerns are a lot more immediate. And it's a different concept when you're thinking of debt from a country than when you are from a person.
What will happen if the government cannot borrow any more money?
Well, I mean, the government is in control of its own currency, and it controls its own interest rates. So we have essentially monetary freedom. There's not going to be an instance where we couldn't increase our own spending at any point. If we reach the ceiling, we can just increase the ceiling. We control our own currency. So there's no risk in that regard in terms of not being able to have enough money.
Can the government file bankruptcy?
It can. For example, Greece had an issue with that, but Greece is part of the European Union and doesn't control its own currency. A country like the United States, it's essentially impossible for us to go bankrupt because we control our own currency. So we have complete monetary freedom. There's no entity above us that controls our money. So it's pretty impossible for the United States.
Do you believe that America is a great country?
Well, I would love to say yes. I really would. I mean, we have a lot of potential, right? Um, we have 25% less people than all of Europe. We have 36% more wealth. We can live very, very comfortable lives economically. But the biggest thing that frustrates me about the United States in particular is the fact that we we create so much friction when it comes to democracy, right? We abandon polling places. We do voter purges. We don't make voting a holiday. We make barriers in front of people to vote, and it limits their ability to impact society. And then it allows the corporate interests in our society to convince a much smaller pool of people that that their interests are in the benefit of everybody. When well, sometimes what's in corporate interests aren't necessarily expressly in the interest of everybody else. To put in perspective, like only 0.17% of America makes $1 million a year. So 99% of America makes less than $1 million. And those corporations, it's a drop in the bucket for them to fund campaigns and win elections. And you'll never know this because they're not obligated to tell you, but a lot of those corporations even write legislation. And it's a drop in the bucket for them to do these things. They invest millions of dollars, billions in elections. And the regular people, when they try to compete to have their own impact, they put everything they have into those things. They scrape away, and eventually when they lose enough times, it's a big impact. Each loss is huge for people who make less than $1 million a year. And it's a drop in the bucket for those corporations. And as they lose, they get, it's like you have like this really big potential. Like imagine like a shell of a really nice car, and then like pieces are scattered across the road. And when you get to the end, you'll have like a finished car, and there's like these wheels right next to the car that you can use to push it faster. And everybody's just scraping it across the street because like it's more beneficial to them. Somebody's paying them to scrape it across the street than just to put the wheels on it. And it's just frustrating because the most frustrating thing about it is like it's the audacity of it. Like they're not even hiding it anymore. You know what I mean? It's like right out in the open, and it's just the audacity of doing it in front of everybody's face. To me, that is like the most frustrating.
Do you believe America was ever great?
It was definitely a lot better. I would say, yeah, there was a time, I would say around the New Deal Democrats, where I would say it was close to being great. There were still problems. There were still racial issues, of course. But it was very close. It was very close. At least economically, like we were moving in the right direction. And then we started to regress, a couple of decades later.
What is your position on the First Amendment?
I mean, my position is the First Amendment is the most important for me specifically. It really bothers me how corporations like Twitter and Facebook, they create terms of service and they use them in very vague ways to select the speech that they like and don't like. I understand people not wanting to like hear upsetting things, or even if they're really nasty or really racist or disgusting things to say, as long as they're not necessarily inciting violence, specifically inciting violence, not like a vague reference to it, then I think I want to live in a society that allows that speech, because it is a drawback to have that speech allowed. But the bigger drawback of creating a system where we try to limit speech is now we're placing a lot of power in an arbiter to decide what's correct speech and what's incorrect speech. And eventually those systems can be corrupted, just like even now, like our elections are completely commoditized now. You have to pay for everything in an election, and it's very expensive. And if you don't run to, like if you're running for profit, you're not going to have enough money. Or if you do have enough money, like funding is going to dry up eventually. So like these systems, even our democracy, our elections can get corrupted. And I really don't want, a system, an arbiter telling us what's correct speech and incorrect speech, eventually corrupted. And then now, like, you have even bigger problems. So I think the First Amendment is like the most important.
What is your position on the Second Amendment?
The Second Amendment, I think, is misinterpreted on purpose, in my opinion. I don't think the founding fathers at the time expected, people to have automatic weapons and the arsenal that exists these days. I mean, their arms is very vague, and bear arms, like, does that mean have it at your house, carry it on you at all times in transit? You can't infringe on the right to bear arms. But what about where they can go out with it, or restrict what kind of arms? And also the first part of it is to maintain a well-regulated militia. Those two things, they do separate a comma, and that's why they interpret it as separate parts of a sentence. But like I said, like the interpretation of it is very nuanced, and I think it's interpreted a specific way to benefit gun lobbyists like NRA and people who support having more lax gun laws. But the drawback to that, as you've seen recently, is we get a lot more violent mass shootings. The United States is unique in its issue with mass shootings, and it's also unique in its ownership of firearms. So those things are correlated, and if we continue to allow such easy access to firearms, the drawback is a lot more people are going to die. And personally, I don't mind regulation that doesn't completely remove firearms, but limits the access to it, so it's not as easy to get, and then a lot more lives will be saved.
The United States is unique in that it was written into our Constitution that everyone has the right to bear arms. Because people have the right to bear arms, it makes it much more difficult for the government to turn on its people. Also, if there is ever an invasion, not only is there a military and police, but everyday people can, if they choose, help protect our country. Therefore, by limiting the Second Amendment, would it not limit the protection for the people?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily possible in any foreseeable future for any country or any combination of countries. There's not the entire world combined. For example, their navies combined by tonnage is less than the United States. We have more aircrafts than the entire world combined several times over. There's no, and they have to cross two massive oceans to reach the United States. So, they will be they will be in direct combat with our Navy. You can't circumvent the Navy to get to us because we're separated by oceans. So it's essentially impossible to invade the United States. I think Abraham Lincoln himself said that there's not any nation or any combination of nations that will see the Rocky Mountains or drink from the Mississippi River by force. And that held true back then, and that holds especially true even more now, because we're far more powerful in relation to other nations than we were back then. The United States is by far, without any close competitor, the most powerful nation on earth. So invading the United States is essentially impossible, and also that makes it so, if the United States really wanted to stamp down on a violent insurrection, they have a lot of tools to do so. Drones, firearms not going to do anything against drones, for example. They can do precision guided strikes with low yield bombs, and they can do and very little casualties, and directly strike only people who are combatants. It's impossible. Like you wouldn't be able to win in that kind of scenario with just light arms. An entire army couldn't beat the United States military. Fighting against them with light arms is entirely useless. So I don't think firearms for that regard is a good justification, because it's just not possible. It's just with the power of the United States military, either scenario is unlikely to happen.
What is your belief on big government?
Well, the state apparatus, like the bureaucrats, I think that they're called big government right now because they are essentially bought out by corporations, and there's very little trust. There's very little democracy. People don't feel represented, so they feel whenever laws are made, it's being imposed. But I think the government being more involved isn't necessarily a bad thing if the government's more democratic. If people can have more of an equal say of who gets in government, then the involvement of the government is in the behest of the people. And I think that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I do agree that as things are exactly right now, with the way government is infested with people who are bought by corporations, then I do think that the more the government involves itself in something, it's to enrich another specific person instead of the benefit of society.
What do you believe should be the role of our federal and state government?
It's the federal government. I think its role is to be the plumber, essentially. Like, you have a house and there's leaks and there's problems. It's like the glue that holds everything together. It funds the projects. It has a built-in surplus recycling mechanism. So like if California makes a lot of money and Mississippi makes very little money, it has a system to transfer funds to Mississippi to pay for systems that it can't pay for itself, to make sure that people in the state live good lives. I think having the federal apparatus on top of the states allows everybody to live more prosperous lives, but only if the government is democratic and the people get a say in who runs it, and we create systems that benefit society much better than we have now. Like, we don't even have basic things like healthcare, for example. But I think the federal government has a potential to do a lot of good for people in society. But right now, I think it's used as a way to pool the wealth of the states and increase the wealth of the United States, and use that competitiveness to increase the wealth of the individual people in society who accumulate it for themselves. The 0.1%, the 0.01% of society that accumulate most of that wealth. They use the federal government to increase their accumulation, but it can be used for better reasons. And having the states is good to have like more granular control of different regions, because like this is a continent-sized country, and having a unitary country this size, it's there's a lot of people with different interests. The states allow you to more granularly control different areas that suit those areas better.
The 10th Amendment states, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people.
Sorry, repeat the question one more time.
I just read the 10th Amendment. That is what's stated in the 10th Amendment.
Sorry, yeah. Repeat one more time. I lost a couple of words in the end there.
Okay. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like that allows states to, create laws that benefit their specific regions, because the federal government can create a system of rules that are like the foundations, the minimum standards. And then those minimum standards might be too little for one state. And if it's too much for another state, then they can reallocate it. But allowing states to govern within their regions that aren't that aren't limited to them by the Constitution gives those states granular control of their specific areas, so people in those areas can serve their own interests. Because what somebody in New York wants is going to be different from somebody in Wyoming wants, and it's good that we have more granular systems of governance that allows people to have their own interests.
Should the U.S. enforce its borders?
Well, enforce, it depends, because like I'm not. I do agree that the United States should have a clear border, and I do agree the United States should monitor who comes in and who doesn't come in. It's necessary, to function and organize a society, to know who gets into a country, who leaves a country. It's good, I think we should have robust background checks to make sure, people aren't a danger to society. But I envision the United States having a border like Canada and the United States have a wonderful border. We monitor people who go in, background checks, etc. I don't think we should militarize the border. Like for example, the border in Mexico in the South. I don't think we should militarize borders like we do down there. We should have checkpoints. We should do background checks if people go to those checkpoints. If they're asking for asylum, especially, we turn back people from Haiti, who were asking for asylum and they had legitimate reasons, and we still rejected them, which of course is against international law. But I think especially people asking for asylum, we should do background checks, and we should make sure that they're safe. But otherwise, everybody should be able to enter the country as long as they're not a danger. And it does. And I don't like the argument of we should only get people who are particularly intelligent or achieved great things necessarily. This country was built on immigration, and I think even if we get people who are poor who survive disasters, I want to live in a country that has the systems to turn people into great things, that have free education, free healthcare. They can invest in themselves and then do great things, regardless of where they came from. So I think that should be the goal instead.
The United States of America has been welcoming immigrants throughout its history, but there has always been a limit to the number of people allowed into the country, and the immigrants had to go through a vetting process. Why should this change now?
I think it's fine to have immigrants go through a vetting process. How rigorous the process, it depends on, I don't think we should make it unnecessarily long. We should make sure it's thorough, completely, completely comprehensive. Make sure that we know for a fact that they're not a danger to anybody. And then once we know that, then they're free to enter. I think it should be comprehensive and thorough, but I don't think it should be unnecessarily long for no reason. And limiting people who come here. I mean, I reject the implication that allowing and not militarizing your border means that you're going to get flooded by hundreds of millions of immigrants. Like, most people want to live good lives at where they are. You'll get some immigration, but I don't think there's going to be enough immigration in our borders at any point where we have to limit it. Like, I don't think we're ever going to get overflown with immigrants. If that starts to happen, then we can have a conversation about limiting it. If that begins to happen, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime in the near future.
Do you agree with this statement? Without border enforcement, immigrants can cross at will, bypass our quotas and vetting system, basically skip the line of people trying to get into this country by following our regulations.
Yeah, I think if you have zero enforcement, those things can happen. And like I said, I don't think we should have zero enforcement. I just don't think it should be overly arduous or unnecessarily long. I think it should be enough to ensure that people aren't a danger, that they're safe for society. And once they are, then once we know that for a fact, then we should allow them through. That's it.
If you were sick and had the choice to get treated anywhere in the world, where would you choose to get treated?
Honestly, I would say probably out of everywhere, probably the UK. The NHS, I would say, is the best system that you can get treated under. It is funded entirely by the government, and it's comprehensive. For it doesn't give dental and stuff like that, but if I was getting injured, it'd cover everything. So like if I was hurt, so I would probably say the UK.
Should the U.S. change its healthcare system?
I mean, the U.S. The healthcare system it has now is completely unjustifiable for a developed country. If you see the amount of people if you see how much people pay per citizen for their healthcare, they pay $10,000 per citizen, more or less. It's roughly that number. And we get very little coverage. We have, and people are paying an immense amount per citizen, and we don't even still have full coverage. If you look at the NHS, for example, people pay $4,000 equivalent because they have a different currency. They pay $4,000 equivalent per citizen, and they get completely covered for everything. If you get injured and you need to be airlifted to a hospital, they pay nothing for that. Everything is completely subsidized by the government, and it's a lot cheaper for them. And the reason for that is because there's no middleman, there's no corporation seeking a profit. It's done explicitly for the benefit of society, When somebody gets hurt or needs medical attention, they receive that medical attention. The society subsidize the cost of it because they know if for whatever reason they need to seek medical attention in the future, they know that it'll be completely subsidized for them too. And having that reassurance is, what most developed countries have. Now, some have, private systems like the Netherlands, for example. But even in the Netherlands, the private companies are required to provide a basic plan that is funded by the government. So every single developed nation has this system of some kind of form or another. And in fact, the United States doesn't is completely unjustifiable and another one of those frustratingly blatant ways that people try to profit off of the expense of everybody else, with our elections and healthcare and, other institutions of the United States.
What is your position on global warming?
Global warming is 100% a serious issue. And, it's ridiculous to me that we're not doing anything about it. But of course, I understand why. Our politics is paralyzed because, people don't have as much democracy as we need to influence the government enough to make real changes. But the people who benefit from the status quo, they have short-term gains and they're not even worried about the long-term losses. And climate change is gonna increase sea level. It's gonna make parts of the ocean toxic. It's going to make some areas of the earth harder to live. And if you thought the migrant crisis was bad, imagine tens of millions of people not being able to live in the region of the planet anymore. It's going to have an even worse migrant crisis. And doing nothing about it is not going to destroy humanity, but it's going to make our comfortable lives impossible. We're going to have to change the way we live to accommodate. And I like, the luxuries that we have. So I think doing as much as we can to mitigate it is imperative. And, there's things that we can do. Like if you look at World War II, the United States, we in the 6 years that people were fighting, the United States made 2 million trucks, 150,000 total artillery, 300,000 planes. Like they made so many things. And, like if we have, and I think Vox did an article about this, and they analyzed what it would take to be 100% renewable. And they had things like 325,000 5 megawatt onshore wind turbines can do 30%. And I think it was 150,000 offshore wind turbines can do another 30%. It was like 50,000 50 megawatt solar power plants can do another. Actually, the offshore wind turbines do 20%. The 50 megawatt, $50,000 megawatt solar panels can do 30%. And there was also 100 megawatt, 2,000 of those can do another 7%. Like they had like a whole thing. And of course, we can make residential solar panels to like make, to make up for the rest as well. Like, there's, we can do geothermal plants. We can diversify it. So, if there's less sun, at one point we overload it. So we put more than we need. So we don't have to worry about like dips. And we can very much build those things within 10 years. Like the United States within the 6 years of World War II, built 2 million trucks, built like 500,000 tanks. Like we can do those things within 10 years if we have directed production. But to get the government to do that, the politicians in place, we will need to expand our democracy first. to be able to get the people in place to direct that production. So, it's a process.
The Earth has been going through temperature changes ever since it has been in existence. How is this time different than the past?
Yeah, I mean there has been, but it's going through a much more rapid change, and it's been accelerated by anthropomorphic reasons, and that's why they call it global warming. That's caused by anthropomorphic climate change, and if you look at the past, you can see the slopes of heating of the planet in the past, and how starkly it's heating up now. And if you look at the carbon in the atmosphere, we have like 400 million parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, which is several magnitudes more than it was in the past. And that's because of the CO2 that we use for our energy. And we knew about this for a long time. It hasn't been a secret. Corporations knew about this for a long time. We have proof that they knew about this for a long time. They purposely suppressed it because they benefit from, extracting these these fossil fuels, and burning the CO2. So, it hasn't been a secret. And I think, we should have a carbon tax for that reason, and it should be retroactive. So we should measure how much those companies contributed to the carbon in the atmosphere, or the CO2 in the atmosphere. And the carbon tax should be retroactive because they purposely suppressed it, knowing the harm it would cause. So it's vastly different than it is naturally.
The US population is less than 10% of the world's population. How is the US to stop climate change?
Well, yeah, of course. The United States by itself, being 100% renewable isn't going to prevent climate change on its own. But we have to remember that the United States, after World War II, it built the systems of that the entire world uses internationally: the United Nations, NATO, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF. These institutions were built by the United States. The United States, like I said before, has the most powerful military. We have massive influence. And if we direct production to build these things for ourselves, you'll have the production capacity to build it for other states. And we can, build it for them, of course, they'll pay for those things, but, and we can help countries that can't afford it. We can subsidize it for them. But we will have the production capacity to build it for other nations as well. And we can have massive influence in getting everybody else on renewable energy because the institutions that we build and the amount of wealth that we control. So I think the United States can do a lot globally to prevent climate change.
There are some in our country that believe the police should be defunded. What is your position on defunding the police?
Well, I mean, I agree with when people who say defund the police, and they mean we should have the police do less of the calls that they're doing, because we allocate everything to the police now. Instead of like, for example, if somebody has a mental health crisis and they're not a violent individual, the police shouldn't be the primary point of contact. They could be there for protection, but we should send somebody who is trained to handle those kind of situations. And I think, like, for example, in that situation that I just explained, it might require funding the police department more, having that. So I agree. I agree with the overall concept, because as police do less things, because that's just one situation, but as police do less things and they're allocated to do less things, they will eventually require less funding. And that's the overall goal. So if defund the police means to reallocate them to something else, and give the police a more focused goal, and I agree with that. If but that term is used as a straw man to say that when people say defund the police, they mean we should have no law enforcement entirely, and it's used as a straw man to attack the overall goal. So I agree with the sentiment, and if you mean it by the actual way the most people call defund the police, then yeah, I agree with that term.
Who or how should the police be replaced?
I think the police, we use them too broadly. The police are like a hammer, like in a toolbox, and if you use a hammer for everything, then it's going to be hit like a nail. Like you're using hammer to fix a screen, you're going to break it. So I think we should have different institutions that we might have to make from scratch, that can replace things like health calls, like special health calls, or replace things like if somebody is breaking some kind of misdemeanor, or like breaking some kind of small infraction, we don't need to send armed officers. We can send a smaller, more general, like security force that is unarmed, for example. But overall, I think we might have to create different institutions to serve different aspects. But using the police for everything is just going to not be suitable. And like I said, like they're just a single tool that we can use in our society. So I think reducing their role and replacing them with more trained individuals to handle different aspects is the best way to go.
A role of the government is to provide peace and safety to its people. One of the ways the government does this is through the police. The police's job is to protect and serve. Do you agree with this definition statement?
I agree with that definition statement, though I don't agree that that's how the police have been operating under necessarily. I think the police are a lot more free to express or free to oppress people. They have a lot more opportunities to abuse powers because there's not enough checks and balances. And I think we should have a lot more scrutinized system. For example, they have immunity, qualified immunity, for example. So if there's not a specific precedent of them doing something, then they can't get in trouble for what they do. But I think those kinds of protections enable people who want to do bad things to do bad things and get no punishment for it. And of course, it's not always the case. It's not that there's zero scrutiny. If it gets bad enough or enough publicity, they'll see consequences. But because scrutiny only applies when things are bad enough, there's a lot of smaller injustices that police get away with all the time. And I think we should scrutinize, people to have the ability to prevent you from going somewhere or have the ability to lock you up. I think we should have a lot more scrutiny in those individuals with that much power.
Abortion is a hot topic. Where do you stand on abortion?
Well, I mean, I would like, of course, to live in a society where it never happens. Like no one likes abortion, but in reality, there are situations where it's necessary, and also there is a period of time where when the baby is or the fetus is unable to survive on its own. I think it's a woman's right to decide whether she wants to keep it or not. If she's involved in maintaining the fetus, then she gets to decide whether or not she wants to have it because it's in her body. Now, of course, if technology advances and we can have like artificial wombs, for example, and we can remove the fetus and keep it alive artificially outside of women, and technology is far more advanced, and we have something like that, then maybe that's a different conversation. But the way things are now, as long as the fetus can't survive on its own, I think that the woman should decide whether she wants to continue the pregnancy or not.
At conception, there is only a fertilized egg, a cell. Then it splits and so forth. That is not a conscious life. At what stage during pregnancy is there life?
I mean, that's a hot debated topic. It depends on when you consider life. Some people say when you get a heartbeat, but that can happen within like 5 or 6 weeks of pregnancy. Some people say when it's viable on its own, which can happen like within 24 weeks of pregnancy. So it depends on where you draw the line. But I personally decide to draw the line of when the fetus is able to survive outside of the mother's womb, then it should be considered another life.
When it comes to incarceration, doing time for doing a crime, there is a debate about racism and unjust bias in the prosecution and sentencing of individuals, people. Do you believe this is the case?
Yeah, I think the United States was built under a system of slavery, and they used racism as a way to divide communities, especially back in the day when they had white indentured servants, and they had black slaves, and they had some Native American slaves. There would be rebellions, and they use racism a lot in ways to prevent white indentured servants from fraternizing with the black slaves and conspiring to maybe do any rebellions or escapes. Famous ones of these are Bacon's Revolution or Brown's Revolution. But when our government evolved eventually through civil rights, it takes more time for society to evolve as well. And there's still impacts from those racist times. The laws necessarily aren't there anymore. There are still some racist people. It's different if people are racist. It's more important if laws are racist. And while laws may not be as racist as they were in the past, they are still feeling the effects of those laws now. And there's still other ways that they can discriminate. Republican politicians have said this in the past as well, that you can hide discrimination in ways of cutting funding, because that most people, because of the history, that are going to be poor are going to be black people. And if you cut funding, it it disproportionately negatively affects Black people. And they've admitted to doing these things in the past, Republican politicians. So there are ways that discrimination still exists, of course, and it's more insidious and systemic. But it is a lot better now than it was in the past. And the only way it can get better is to understand these systemic issues that we still have now, and work to fix that as well.
How would you fix it?
Well, mostly I would fix it by essentially creating a government that benefits everybody in society, no matter where they come from. So it's impossible for our government to be racist, because the benefits that you get from the government will be universal for everybody, no matter where you come from, who you're born to, what conditions you were born under. You should have universal benefits from the government, from society, universal standards. And so there's no possibility for our laws to be racist.
Laws and justice. During this COVID pandemic, government officials were letting prisoners out of jail. At the same time, some of the US population was told if they violated the COVID distancing practices, they could face fines and jail time of up to 1 year. What are your thoughts on this as it pertains to justice reform?
I don't have a problem with those policies or those punishments that were given, as long as these restrictions were put in place through due process. I don't think that as long as there's proper due process and it's from the majority of the people, if they want restrictions for the benefit of everybody else, especially in times of a pandemic, I don't think that's a problem. As long as the due process was there. Now, of course, because our society is not very democratic, it's hard for regular people to have that due process. While I think the restrictions were beneficial, I still don't like the way they were implemented, because it was implemented unilaterally rather than having it democratically. And I just the United States should the more it has a not undemocratic system of governance, maybe the next time those decisions that were made unilaterally won't be made in the benefit of society. So while I think the restrictions were beneficial, and they were not effective enough, of course, like they were beneficial, but didn't go far enough. So it didn't really matter. It didn't really do anything. But it was better than nothing. I think that having the system that we have to make those decisions could be a negative outcome for us in the future.
So you went into my next question, which is, do you think the federal and state government has been doing a good job handling the COVID outbreak?
Yeah, well, I can expand upon it a little bit, because I don't think they did a good job whatsoever. You have to remember that COVID was detected in China a long time ago. And we already know that Trump knew about this, but downplayed it because he didn't want it to hurt his chances. But then it got bad enough to where he couldn't downplay it anymore, and he didn't want people to panic. But he understood what COVID was. We know people explained it to him, and he purposely ignored the dangers. We are a separate continent from China. We could have made sure the people coming back were screened properly, quarantined properly. We could make sure that we had the right checks and balances, and we could have prevented COVID from being a serious problem on this continent whatsoever. We had all the tools. We had pre-hand knowledge of the virus before it came to our continent. We could have prepared, but there was no preparation done. And by the time Biden took office, it was already a mess. And he hasn't done enough, Biden himself, to correct the ship. And it's definitely much better than Trump, of course. Like, he did a far better job than if we continued through Trump. But there's still a lot that he didn't do. There are people like the stimulus package wasn't enough for everybody. There are still people who are close to losing their houses. There's still a lot of people negatively affected by the pandemic, and there hasn't been enough done to mitigate those damages.
How would you handle the COVID pandemic?
Well, I mean, if you're going to have a lockdown, of course, I would put it through like some kind of referendum, because if you want to have a lockdown, it has to be strict. So everybody has to agree to like a temporary lockdown, hard 15-day lockdown, where we make sure that anyone who has it doesn't have it anymore. We have testing, contact tracing, making sure that it's gotten rid of. And then, we go back to society and continue on as it was before. Places like Taiwan, South Korea did similar things, and they had robust systems of contact tracing. And, they brought down COVID-19 drastically, but that's only after it got really bad. If we were like Vietnam, who prepared beforehand and made sure that COVID didn't enter, we wouldn't need lockdowns whatsoever. So like, if I was there from the very beginning, I would actually prefer something more like Vietnam, where we knew COVID was coming. We made preparations first. We prevented it from getting to the country, and we maintained this contact tracing. We maintained testing. Like, Vietnam has rigorous and seamless testing stations all over the country. And so if we tested vigorously, contact trace anyone who got it, and did quarantines for people coming in properly, I think we would never need a single lockdown in North America.
Does that infringe on people's liberties?
I think once it gets bad enough, you're going to have to at some point, or decide to never get rid of the virus, because of the nature of the virus. It's an aerosol virus that gets spread, just by inhaling it, and it is very contagious, and it survives a long time on surfaces. So the contagious nature of this virus is that you're going to need some strict lockdowns to be able to curb the virus. So you have to make a concession whether you want to keep the virus forever, or a strict lockdown at some point if it gets bad enough. But I think if we prepared in the very beginning, before the virus got to North America, I don't think it restricts people's freedom to do quarantines when they leave the country, and they're coming back, to make sure that they don't spread the virus to anybody else. I think it would be a lot more restricting if we didn't do those quarantines at the beginning, and then everybody has to go on a lockdown.
Education of our children has made its way into the national media. What are your thoughts on our education system?
Well, I mean, the education system is one of those institutions that has been blatantly commoditized for the profit of certain corporations like Pearson, for example. and the lower education up to high school is still publicly provided, but the standards are the funding is done by the taxes, the property taxes of the area, and so it's also discriminatory to places that are low, that don't have that are poor, and poor places are disproportionately Black. So it's a system to discriminate against those who are Black, and it's also commoditized in the higher end. So, like in the higher education in college, everything is commoditized: your textbooks, your classes. Sometimes you have to pay for reading material. Like it's the everything you do in college is commoditized. So in lower education, you might have poor education because you live in a poor neighborhood, and then when you get to higher education, you have to pay for everything, and it's designed that way for not for the benefit of society, but for the benefit of a few individuals. And I think a more an education system that is focused on making sure that the education is the highest quality for everybody in society. Like I don't think that you should pay more for better education. I think you should get the best education no matter who it is, for everyone in society, so everybody can be the most informed. And it may cost more, but it's an investment. You pay upfront for that better education for everybody now, and then those educated people will return that investment in the future. So I think having the best education for everybody universally is the best way to do that in lower and higher education.
What should be taught to our children?
Well, I think the best way to do it, if you're asking me like my future, I think one way I would really love to see education is just starting from verified sources, of course, in the beginning of history. And when you're a little kid, in the beginning of education, you start with the beginning of human history, or the history of the planet. And it's of course not going to be very complicated for a little kid, but as time goes on and they get older, and you go through history, you make the explanations more complicated, and you make, actually I would say human history. You should start with human history. They can I think like the world history is too much, but start with human history, and as they get older, and you're going through history, then you can introduce things like mathematics as they happen during history. I think that'd be an interesting way to teach people. But I would think that following like understood, proven methods would probably be safer. I think Finland is probably the best system from what I can tell. They educate teachers, and the teachers are the primary arbiters of their curriculum. And so teachers have to go through a lot of education, of course, like they are some of the most well-educated people in their country, and they create their curriculum. And I think that is, I think that's pivotal in having the best education, because the way we do it now is think tanks like the Enrine Institute or the Mercator Center, like these separate think tanks have a big role, even companies, in creating the curriculum. And I think that, it has an adverse effect on our education. So I think, making the teacher role more integral in the curriculum and creating the curriculum, and of course requiring higher education standards for that, I think is the best way to go about it.
What should not be taught to our children and or left to the discretion of the parents?
Well, anything that isn't necessary for things like anything that's not necessary for living in society. You can't teach a kid how to be a good person. In school, of course, that's something that the parents have to do. So, the things that are not necessary for functioning in society, the things of personhood, of how to treat people. We can encourage it in school, of course, but the parents are going to have a primary role in those kinds of things. So I don't think that you can teach those things in school. But anything that they need to function in society, mathematics, science, biology, anatomy, even sex courses, of course, when they're old enough, understanding human anatomy and sex and the intricacies of it, and the STDs, for example. I think that's necessary to learn in school, but of course, when they're old enough, there are things that are going to be in the primary role of the parent, making sure that your kid grows up to be a good person. Is not something that they can learn in school. Though, like I said, I think schools should encourage it.
This has been an interview with Juan Paredes, Democrat, running for United States Representative, State of Florida, District 28.
All right, thank you. I appreciate you having me. I really do support you doing this to give everybody as much information as they can to make sure they're the most informed when they're going out to vote. And of course, I appreciate the platform as well. So thank you.